24 hours inside CECOT. El Salvador's most dangerous prison. The world's harshest war on gangs. Imagine a place so dangerous that even guards wear bulletproof vests. Where the power of violent gangs rivals the authority of the state. This is CECOT, El Salvador's most notorious and brutal prison. But what happens inside when you take a prison that's already a powder keg of violence, and turn it into a battleground in a government's war on gangs? The story we're about to tell you is one of unimaginable fear, raw power, and the fight for survival. One day. One prison. And a world of chaos. The prison behind the war. In the heart of El Salvador, where the violence of gangs spills into the streets, there's one place that stands out as the epicenter of brutality. The Centro Penal de Confinamiento del Oriente, better known as CECOT, is a prison like no other. It's more than a correctional facility, it's the last line of defense in a war that has plagued El Salvador for decades. A war between the government and the country's most feared gangs, the MS-13 and 18th Street Gang. The war didn't start in CECOT, but it is fueling the fire that has consumed this already volatile place. CECOT has become a symbol of the government's harsh tactics to crush gang activity, an effort to dismantle the very organizations that have grown so powerful they could run the streets of El Salvador from the inside. The prison is not just a place for criminals, it has become a stronghold, and a battleground. Built to hold 800 inmates, CECOT now houses over 3,000, and the numbers are climbing every year. Each one of these men is part of a larger criminal network, either in the gangs or aligned with them. Gangs control the streets, and now, they control the inside too. But the government's strategy isn't one of negotiation or leniency. It's a zero-tolerance approach. Under the policy of former President Bukele, CECOT became a symbol of a no-excuses fight against gangs, with plans to strip even basic human rights from the men inside. The walls of CECOT don't just keep prisoners in, they serve as physical and symbolic boundaries in a fight that stretches far beyond the prison gates. For the guards and the prisoners alike, each day is a struggle to hold on to power, control, and sometimes life itself. Inside the walls. From the moment you enter CECOT, the atmosphere is suffocating. It's not just the oppressive heat of El Salvador's tropical climate, but the weight of tension that hangs in the air. The prison's design is deceptively simple: concrete walls, steel bars, and a sprawling network of cells, each one crowded with men who live in constant fear. But inside those walls, a hierarchy exists, one that doesn't follow the rules of the state. Each section of the prison is controlled by the gangs, with MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang divided into territories. Even the prisoners who aren't part of these gangs fall under their rule, forced to comply or face the wrath of a system that thrives on violence. The guards. They are heavily outnumbered, and their presence barely makes a dent in the daily operations inside. Despite the government's strict measures to curb gang influence, CECOT is a place where power dynamics are ever shifting. The most influential gang leaders are often housed in maximum security units, isolated from the rest of the prison. But even in solitary confinement, they maintain control. How? Through cell phones smuggled in by bribed guards. Communication between the outside world and these gang leaders doesn't stop. They direct operations, orchestrate violence, and issue threats with chilling precision, all from the confines of their cells. It's a system of organized chaos, where violence is not only tolerated but encouraged. The gang leaders have found ways to exploit every inch of power they can, using fear as currency. Every day is a fight for survival, and alliances within the prison shift as quickly as the prisoner's loyalty can be bought. For the general population of prisoners, survival doesn't just mean staying alive, it means making the right choices. Pick the wrong side, and you could find yourself being dragged into one of the countless gang wars that rage within the prison walls. Refuse to join. You could become a target. Whether it's by a simple knife or a brutal beating, the consequences of defiance are immediate, violent, and deadly. Gang members here don't wait for opportunities to kill, they make them. A glance, a word, or even the wrong person standing too close can result in a deadly confrontation. To stay safe, prisoners often have no choice but to align themselves with one of the gangs, choosing between violence that promises protection and the humiliation of becoming a target. Inmates who manage to survive their first year inside CECOT have either found their niche in the gang system or learned how to disappear into the crowd. But those who try to resist often become statistics in the ongoing violence that plagues this place. The government's plans to dismantle gang influence in CECOT include drastic measures, such as isolating gang members in separate facilities and restricting communication to prevent coordination. But these moves rarely work. Instead of breaking the gangs, they have created new and more brutal systems of control within the prison. Even more concerning, the prison's overcrowded conditions, with far too few staff to manage the population, have made human rights abuses an inevitability. The daily struggle for food, the harsh living conditions, the lack of medical care, these are just some of the everyday horrors that inmates must endure. The government's war on gangs has led to an increasing number of prison riots, as desperate prisoners, already pushed to their limits, rise up against the system that imprisons them. The prisoners know one thing for sure: they can't trust anyone outside the walls of CECOT, and survival comes at a high price. The war for control. Inside CECOT, the lines between order and chaos blur. The battle for dominance isn't just fought with weapons, but through psychological warfare, manipulation, and brute force. The government may control the gates, but the gangs control the heart of the prison. The real war for control is fought in the shadows of CECOT's overcrowded halls, where alliances shift, and loyalty is bought with the promise of power, protection, and fear. Every day, prisoners wake up knowing they are just one wrong move away from triggering another bloody conflict. The power of the MS 13 and 18th Street gang has spread like wildfire within these walls, with each gang constantly trying to outmaneuver the other. But it's not just about territory. It's about control over the economy of the prison, which has become an underground network of illicit activities. From the smuggling of drugs, weapons, and cell phones to the extortion of new inmates, CECOT operates like a criminal enterprise in its own right. Money flows through the prison via the gangs, and those who refuse to join or cooperate are left to suffer the consequences. Every commodity inside CECOT is in short supply: food, cigarettes, toiletries, and even the most basic forms of human connection. Power is currency, and to survive, prisoners must understand that there are no innocent bystanders here. Even the smallest of transactions can escalate into full-blown violence, especially when rival factions are involved. Debt, disrespect, and broken promises are dealt with swiftly and mercilessly. If you owe money to the wrong person, you can be sure your life will be in danger. If you offend a higher-ranking gang member, your fate is sealed. There is no concept of fairness or justice in a place like CECOT, only power, and those who can seize it, keep it. But it's not just the gangs who are playing the game. The prison guards, tasked with overseeing this sprawling system of chaos, are often overworked and underpaid, and some are complicit in the activities that fuel the prison's criminal ecosystem. Guards turn a blind eye to the dealings going on under their noses, often accepting bribes or smuggling goods themselves. Some guards are even aligned with the gangs, using their position of authority to further their own interests or act as middlemen between gang leaders and the outside world. This relationship between the guards and the gangs has turned CECOT into something far more sinister than just a prison. It's a criminal compound. The government, in an effort to curb the growing gang control, instituted a war on gangs policy, which meant more surveillance, tighter restrictions, and the separation of gang members from general prisoners. But while this might have worked on paper, it didn't account for the sheer power and reach the gangs had. The most powerful figures in CECOT aren't the guards, they're the inmates. A few gang leaders, who've managed to maintain control of their territories, still give orders from the safety of their cells. These men have earned the trust and fear of their subordinates, and they rule with an iron fist. Even behind bars, their influence extends to the outside, where they continue to pull strings, making deals with other criminal organizations and even maintaining control over local communities. One of the most chilling aspects of CECOT's power dynamics is the way in which young inmates are recruited into the gangs. The new arrivals, often from poorer neighborhoods or families caught in the web of crime, are faced with a harsh choice: either join a gang for protection, or face certain death. For these young men, CECOT is not just a prison, it is their only shot at survival. Gangs provide them with a sense of belonging and security, even if it comes at the cost of their freedom and humanity. The gangs know this, and they exploit it. The MS 13 and 18th Street Gang, with their roots deep in El Salvador and their reach extending across borders, use violence, threats, and intimidation to recruit. They prey on the vulnerable, promising them protection in exchange for loyalty. The moment a new recruit steps into the prison, they're expected to prove their worth. Bloodshed is inevitable. Whether it's a brutal initiation or a calculated hit, the gang's leaders know that fear breeds loyalty, and in CECOT, loyalty is everything. The government's attempts to combat the growing gang violence by introducing a military presence in the prison have only made matters worse. The soldiers who patrol CECOT are seen as just another obstacle to the gang's operations. Rather than stopping the flow of illegal goods or controlling violence, the presence of military forces has created new tensions, adding to the prison's already volatile atmosphere. In this environment, survival isn't just about avoiding violence, it's about mastering the art of coexistence with the brutal system that governs everything inside. The deadly rituals. The world behind bars in CECOT is a place where survival isn't guaranteed, and the price of life is steep. Every day inside the prison is a battle, not just for power, but for survival. The gangs, especially the MS 13 and 18th Street Gang, are not just violent groups, they have their own code, their own rituals, and their own way of establishing dominance within the brutal world of CECOT. These gangs aren't just fighting each other, they are creating an ecosystem of terror that stretches across the prison. One of the most chilling aspects of gang life inside CECOT is the ritualistic violence that accompanies every step of a prisoner's life. For gang members, committing violence is part of the job description. For new recruits, it's a rite of passage, an initiation that often involves bloodshed, torture, or other brutal acts. This violence, while horrific, is designed to do more than just instill fear in their enemies. It's a way of building a sense of belonging and loyalty among those who join. The first step of initiation often involves a brutal beating, a gang-led attack, or sometimes something even more sinister, a murder. But these acts aren't random, they are calculated to test the recruit's loyalty and willingness to bleed for the gang. Those who survive this ordeal are accepted into the fold. Those who fail, who cry out, show fear, or hesitate, are often left to bleed out in a corner, as a chilling reminder to others about the consequences of weakness. But it's not just about the initiations. For the gang leaders who sit in their cells, untouched by the violence around them, the true power lies in manipulating the events that unfold within CECOT. The leaders orchestrate everything, from the supply of drugs and weapons to the control of the prison's underground economy. They communicate with their foot soldiers through coded messages, cell phone networks, and the internet, bypassing the efforts of the guards to keep them from staying connected. Even more disturbing, the gang leaders maintain a tight grip on the prison's social structure. There is no escaping this hierarchy. Every day, a select few will rise to the top, while those at the bottom will be used or discarded when no longer needed. To survive in CECOT, inmates have to master the system, and this isn't just about fighting, it's about knowing when to fight, when to lay low, and how to manipulate those around you. One of the most disturbing rituals of gang culture in CECOT is the violent enforcement of respect. It's not just about establishing dominance, it's about ensuring that every prisoner knows their place in the system. This sense of control is reinforced through random acts of terror, sudden attacks, random executions, or calculated beatings that show everyone that the gangs own the prison. These acts are never personal, they are simply part of maintaining power. The gangs remind everyone of their influence and their ability to enforce their will. But the gang members in CECOT aren't just looking out for themselves, they're also expanding their reach beyond the prison walls. Through the use of cell phones smuggled in by corrupt guards, the gangs direct their operations in the outside world. They manage the drug trade, control protection rackets, and continue to recruit new members to their cause. These recruits are not just inmates in CECOT, they are the future soldiers of an organized criminal empire that spans the country. The longer someone spends inside the walls of CECOT, the more embedded they become in this criminal system. The government's harsh tactics, such as limiting visits, conducting cell searches, and placing gang members in solitary confinement, have only sparked more violence. The belief that the gangs will never be broken fuels a certain desperation in their leaders. The brutality of the prison is not just physical, it is psychological, as the government's attempt to control the gangs only seems to fuel the fire of resistance. It's as though the government's policies are inadvertently strengthening the gangs, making them more desperate and more powerful. The most damaging effect of these brutal tactics is that they create a system where violence becomes normalized. For the young men inside CECOT, the prison becomes a place where they either have to become part of the system or face a life of continuous violence. This isn't just a matter of survival, it's about adapting to an environment where you are forced to make alliances, commit atrocities, or face certain death. And as the government pushes forward with harsh anti-gang measures, the gangs have only become more entrenched, making the fight for control inside CECOT even more brutal. The government's war on gangs. As CECOT becomes more entrenched in violence, the government of El Salvador continues its brutal war against gangs, determined to eradicate the power that has consumed the prison system. President Bukele's administration, upon taking office, took an uncompromising stance against gang violence, pledging to end the reign of terror that had plagued El Salvador for decades. But while the war on gangs began with a wave of support, the reality of the government's methods would prove to be far more controversial. One of the central strategies was the construction of new, high-security prisons designed specifically to segregate and isolate gang leaders from the rest of the population. CECOT, already infamous for its overcrowding and violence, became ground zero for this war. Under the new regime, gang members who were deemed the most dangerous were separated from the general prison population, isolated in cells designed to break their will. These cells were Spartan, with no windows, no access to TV or radio, and often no human interaction except for occasional guards. The goal was clear: break their spirit, strip them of their influence, and create an environment where the gang's power would collapse. But the isolation wasn't enough. The government also implemented draconian measures, handcuffing inmates 24/7, restricting their movement, and placing them in complete solitary confinement. The rationale was that, if the gangs couldn't communicate with each other, their operations would cease. No more messages smuggled in, no more coordination, and no more control. It was a strategy that left no room for negotiation, it was total warfare. Inside CECOT, however, the gangs were not just helplessly watching their empire crumble. Even in the most isolated cells, their leaders continued to orchestrate operations. Their influence, it seemed, could never be fully erased. The black market inside CECOT flourished, despite the government's best efforts to crush it. Inmates with the right connections continued to smuggle weapons, drugs, and even cell phones into the facility, often with the help of corrupt officials. The gangs continued to control the underground economy, despite the government's increasingly harsh crackdown. This only deepened the conflict. In response, the government ramped up its violent measures, sending in military units, conducting high-risk raids, and employing sniper teams to target inmates who posed the greatest threat. These actions, meant to intimidate the gangs, had the opposite effect. Rather than weakening their grip, they pushed the gangs into a more aggressive posture. Prison riots became more frequent, with inmates fighting back against the government's oppressive tactics. For the average prisoner in CECOT, life under these new conditions was a living nightmare. The crackdown had created a situation where everyone, even those not affiliated with gangs, was caught in the crossfire. Random beatings, brutal suppression of any form of dissent, and lack of medical care became the norm. But the government's rhetoric was clear: the ends justified the means. To them, the war on gangs was a necessary evil, a means of restoring order in a country that had been ravaged by years of violence. Yet the consequences of these policies became increasingly apparent. Human rights groups and international observers began to criticize the government's tactics, citing the excessive use of force and the inhumane treatment of prisoners. Inmates, some of whom had been in CECOT for minor crimes, were now being treated as though they were the worst criminals in history, with no possibility of rehabilitation. The prison population in CECOT, already struggling with overcrowding, was now faced with a dangerous mix of fear and anger. Those who weren't aligned with gangs became collateral damage, forced into a cycle of violence and retribution. The prison's infrastructure began to collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction. Guards, already overwhelmed, were forced to turn a blind eye to the growing chaos. Despite the government's efforts to instill order, CECOT became even more unmanageable. To many prisoners, the government's policies were a cruel joke. The gangs, after all, were far more organized and effective than the state's enforcement measures. The government's harsh approach seemed to be doing little to change the situation. In fact, it was only adding fuel to an already raging fire. Yet in the eyes of the gang leaders, the government's actions weren't signs of weakness, they were proof of strength. The harsher the measures, the stronger their resolve. They would fight back, no matter the cost. They had always known that fear was their greatest ally, and now, they were using it to their advantage. Despite the ongoing violence and the prison riots, the government pressed on with its strategy. The war was far from over. Inside CECOT, gang leaders continued to manipulate the system from behind bars, while the average prisoners, caught between the power struggles of the gangs and the government's forces, wondered if there was any hope left. The rise of resistance. As the government's war on gangs in CECOT continued to escalate, something unexpected began to stir inside the prison, a growing sense of resistance. The system, which had been designed to isolate and break the gangs, was now forcing the prisoners to come together, despite the lines that separated them. For many, the brutality of the crackdown pushed them to the breaking point, and the desire for unity became stronger than the fear of violence or retaliation. For the first time in years, factions within the prison that were once at odds with each other began to collaborate. Inmates who had never before considered working with rival gangs found themselves forming uneasy alliances. These alliances were born out of necessity, survival, they realized, could only be achieved if they stood together. The military presence that had been introduced by the government to curb gang control had only increased the level of chaos. The soldiers patrolling CECOT, heavily armed and highly trained, were often a constant presence, but their ability to control the violence was minimal. The sheer number of prisoners far outmatched the number of guards, and the gangs, despite the government's aggressive tactics, still controlled much of the prison economy. They knew how to work the system, how to exploit weaknesses in the government's tactics. As the days went on, the prison grew increasingly volatile. The crackdown, intended to disrupt the gang networks, was only serving to amplify the problem. Riots, fueled by the suppression of basic rights, became more frequent. The prisoners' resistance wasn't just a physical battle anymore, it had turned into a fight for their dignity, their freedom, and their humanity. CECOT, once a place where gang members operated with brutal precision, had now become a symbol of defiance. The government had hoped that isolating gang leaders and increasing control would bring about order, but instead, it only gave the prisoners more of a reason to rebel. The war that started with the government trying to break the gangs was now becoming something much larger, a fight for control over the soul of the prison itself. The inmates weren't just reacting to the violence they experienced daily. They were also reacting to the human rights abuses that had become routine. The brutality of the guards, the overcrowding, the lack of medical care, the starvation, these were all contributing factors to the growing unrest. The inmates saw the state as their real enemy, not just the rival gangs. But what made the resistance so dangerous wasn't just the anger of the prisoners. It was the growing sense of unity within CECOT's population. The gangs, for all their violence, had the organized structure needed to challenge the government's authority. Their ruthless efficiency became a force that could no longer be ignored. The government's attempt to dismantle gang power only pushed the prisoners further into the arms of those very gangs. The fear that the gang leaders held over the general population was real, but so was the anger the prisoners felt against their oppressors. The question was no longer about gang violence versus government oppression. It had evolved into a collective struggle for freedom, with prison walls acting as a prison for the soul. For the first time, the prisoners were fighting not only for survival, but for the very concept of self-determination. And the government's response to this growing resistance was only more violent repression. The military ramped up its presence, moving in heavily armed units to suppress any signs of defiance. The guards, now under stricter orders, were more brutal than ever, making daily life inside the prison even more unbearable. Yet, despite the overwhelming force, the prisoners' unity only grew stronger. Through secret meetings, covert communications, and coordinated actions, they began to organize against their oppressors. They were learning from each other, sharing information, and, above all, preparing for the day when they would be forced to face the full wrath of the government. The prison, once a place of gang violence and control, had become a microcosm of El Salvador's larger struggle. It was no longer just about gang leadership or government control. It was about the right to live with dignity, the right to challenge the system that had built this brutal world, and the desire for a better future. The walls of CECOT may have been designed to contain violence, but they had also become the backdrop for something else, resistance. And as the government continued to tighten its grip, the question on every prisoner's mind was, how much longer could they survive under this system? The resistance was growing, but so was the tension. The stage was set for a violent and deadly confrontation, one that would reshape the future of CECOT and send ripples of change throughout the country. The breaking point. Days in CECOT had become more than just a struggle for survival, they had become a countdown to a breaking point. Every corner of the prison was filled with tension. The atmosphere, already heavy with the smell of sweat, iron, and fear, now felt like it was thick enough to cut through. The war between the gangs and the government had escalated beyond a mere clash of power, it had transformed into a battle for control of the future of El Salvador. The unity among prisoners, once forged out of the need to survive, had now become a force to be reckoned with. While the government's military forces had ramped up their presence, they had failed to break the prisoners' spirit. The gangs may have been divided, but in this moment, their shared goal of survival and resistance had brought them together. They no longer feared the guards, they feared the continued oppression that had broken their lives. Word had begun to spread throughout the prison that something was coming. In whispers, through coded messages, and in the secret corners of the cell blocks, plans were being made. Prisoners who had never spoken to each other now stood side by side, preparing for the inevitable moment when they would either fall or rise together. The resistance wasn't just a reaction to the violence of the state anymore, it had become an organized movement against everything the government had tried to impose. The night was always the most dangerous time in CECOT. When the lights went down, when the guards were distracted or off their shifts, the prison came alive with secret meetings, silent gestures, and coded signals. For days, prisoners had been preparing for an explosive response to the constant brutality they faced. They had been gathering what little they could, makeshift weapons, sharp objects, and tools hidden away from the eyes of the guards. In one of the most densely packed cell blocks, a group of prisoners had come up with a plan. They had linked up with members from multiple factions, including former rivals, and crafted an escape plan. It wasn't just about fleeing, it was about striking back. This wasn't an escape in the traditional sense. It was a full-fledged rebellion, a coordinated uprising that would involve a series of attacks on the guards, an attempt to take control of key areas, and a signal to the outside world that they weren't going down quietly. The plan was risky. The stakes were incredibly high. The moment they acted, there would be no turning back. The government would likely respond with force, flooding the prison with military personnel, perhaps using air support or helicopters, and definitely sending in heavily armed soldiers. The prisoners knew this. The guards knew this. And yet, the temptation to fight back was stronger than ever. The prison's communications network had been hacked. It wasn't just about cell phones and smuggled messages anymore. The prisoners had found ways to tap into the prison's own systems, using it to their advantage. The surveillance cameras, once tools of the government's control, had been disabled. The internal radio system, which the guards used to communicate, was now under the prisoners' control. It was a dangerous game, but one they had to play if they were to have any hope of regaining control. And then, at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the plan went into action. The first signal was a loud bang, a firecracker, set off in the southern end of the prison. This was the signal. Guards scrambled, radios crackled, and chaos erupted. The prisoners had started their uprising. In cell block B, the first fight broke out. Prisoners rushed the guards, disarming them and quickly taking control of the guard tower. The sniper positions were neutralized within minutes. The first barrier had fallen. But this wasn't a typical riot. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was a rebellion. A full-scale war had begun. The MS-13, the 18th Street Gang, and even the smaller factions had joined forces. They weren't just targeting the guards anymore, they were targeting the prison itself, its broken system, and the people who had trapped them here for so long. The government had underestimated the power of the inmates' unity. The gangs, who had once been at war with each other, had come together under one common goal, to tear down the system that had oppressed them for so long. Inside CECOT, it was clear, the revolution was here. As the violence unfolded, the outside world started to take notice. The media caught wind of what was happening, and news reports began circulating. But on the inside, the fight for control wasn't just about breaking free, it was about proving that the power of the people could no longer be ignored. They weren't just fighting the guards or the prison system, they were fighting for their humanity. The prison gates that had once stood as barriers were now in the hands of the prisoners. Control was slipping away from the guards. The government, in its desperation to crush the resistance, sent in backup, but they were met with a prison-wide barricade of resistance. Every corridor, every stairwell, every corner had become a fortress of defiance. The government had hoped that military presence and isolation would break the spirit of the inmates. Instead, it had done the opposite. CECOT had become a symbol of resistance, and the inmates had proven that even in the face of overwhelming force, they could not be easily broken. The aftermath. By dawn, the chaos inside CECOT had reached its peak. What started as a series of coordinated skirmishes had rapidly turned into a full-blown prison rebellion. Gunshots echoed through the concrete halls, and the muffled sounds of fighting seeped out of every corner of the prison. For the first time, the prisoners were in control, and the atmosphere was charged with a mix of adrenaline, fear, and a sense of liberation. The government's response was swift and violent. Within hours, a military task force had been mobilized to reclaim control over the prison. Armed with assault rifles, tear gas, and armored vehicles, they stormed the gates of CECOT. But the prisoners weren't easily subdued. They had transformed the prison into a fortress, using their knowledge of the layout and the overcrowded conditions to their advantage. Every cell, hallway, and guard tower became a battlefield. Gang leaders, once isolated in their cells, were now leading the charge from the front lines. They had turned the very weapons that were meant to break them into tools of resistance. Makeshift weapons, including sharp metal objects and crude firearms, were used to fend off the oncoming soldiers. The prisoners knew that if they lost control now, their rebellion would be crushed, and they would return to a more brutal, oppressive system than before. As the battle unfolded, the government forces began to realize that this wasn't just a standard prison riot. It was a desperate, organized resistance, one that had been building inside the prison for months, if not years. The government had miscalculated the resolve of the prisoners, and the extent of their preparation was catching the authorities off guard. Outside the prison walls, the situation was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. News outlets from across El Salvador and even international media were covering the unfolding drama. The images of soldiers storming the prison, prisoners defending their ground, and the chaos within were broadcasted to the world. What had once been a local issue had now become a global story about the rise of a violent rebellion in the heart of El Salvador's most infamous prison. While the world watched in real time, inside CECOT, the prisoners were fighting for more than just survival, they were fighting for dignity. For years, they had lived under brutal conditions. They had been subjected to torture, dehumanizing treatment, and corruption. Now, in this moment, they had found something that had eluded them for so long, a sense of power, a sense of control. The moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. But even as the battle raged, there were whispers in the prison about what would happen next. Would the government back down? Would the prisoners succeed in holding their ground, or would this just be the beginning of a bloodier war? As the fighting intensified, one thing was clear, the government had underestimated the resolve of these men. As the hours passed, the military began to regain control over certain parts of the prison. The battle for the guard towers was fierce, with prisoners trying to hold on to their positions and government forces struggling to break through. But despite the overwhelming force, the prisoners had managed to hold on to several key areas, including the central courtyard, where many of the gang leaders were coordinating the defense. The government's strategy of military force had proven to be less effective than anticipated. The prisoners were well prepared, and their knowledge of the prison's layout gave them a distinct advantage. The soldiers, who had been trained for external threats, were now facing an enemy that knew the prison better than they did. Even the riot gear and armed tactics were unable to break the prisoners' resolve. Inside the prison, those who had been caught in the middle of the violence, innocent inmates who had been swept up in the rebellion, were finding themselves trapped in the crossfire. Many had tried to stay out of the conflict, but in a place like CECOT, neutrality wasn't an option. As the days wore on, it became clear that the government's military response would have lasting consequences. Blood would be shed, and many would not survive. As the rebellion reached its apex, the prisoners were left with a hard choice: push forward, or retreat and face a harsher form of punishment. For many, the idea of retreat was out of the question. This wasn't just about a prison fight, this was about freedom, survival, and the chance to live without the constant oppression of the system that had held them captive for so long. They were willing to sacrifice everything to send a message. But in the end, the government's military might prove too much to overcome. As the battle stretched into its second day, the prisoners began to falter. The government had brought in reinforcements, and the military had started to gain ground. The prison's gates, which had once been a symbol of freedom, were now being fortified by the very forces that had come to crush the rebellion. CECOT had been brought to the brink of collapse. The prisoners had fought with everything they had, but in the end, it wasn't enough. As the last remnants of the rebellion were put down, the prison returned to the control of the state, but at what cost? The government had won the battle, but the war for the soul of CECOT was far from over. The prisoners had sent a powerful message: they would never be fully broken. And for the authorities, this would not be the last time they faced a challenge within these walls. The events inside CECOT had sent shockwaves far beyond the prison walls. What had begun as an internal uprising, a desperate struggle for survival and autonomy, had quickly escalated into a national crisis. Inmates fighting for their lives, the government's military crackdown, the rebellion's fleeting success, all were now headline news. El Salvador's most dangerous prison had become a symbol of the country's larger battle with gang violence, corruption, and human rights violations. Outside, the streets of San Salvador were filled with protests, some in support of the government, demanding stronger action against gang control, while others decried the brutal tactics of the military response, questioning the human cost of a war that seemed to be getting out of hand. Activists, human rights organizations, and political leaders had all weighed in on the violence that had spilled out of CECOT. The international community was watching, and El Salvador's reputation was on the line. In the days following the rebellion, the government issued a statement calling the riot a necessary action in the fight against gangs, with President Bukele reaffirming his commitment to end gang violence at all costs. "We will not allow the gangs to control our country," he said during a televised address. "Their prison riots will not go unpunished." But those words didn't sit well with everyone. While the public, many of whom had lived in fear of gang violence for years, cheered the government's tough stance, others were alarmed at the growing number of prisoners killed or tortured during the military crackdown. Inside CECOT, the government's hardline tactics had only fueled the fire. Those who had managed to survive the uprising, gang members and regular prisoners alike, were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. The prison had become a battlefield, not just for power, but for identity. What did it mean to survive in a place like CECOT? Was there any dignity left when the only choice was to fight back or be crushed underfoot? As the government increased its crackdown on gang leadership, sending more military forces into the prison, the inmates had no choice but to adapt. The resistance was far from over. Despite the losses, there was a deep, underlying belief that they had made a statement, that CECOT, a place once completely dominated by gangs, had shown the world that even in the darkest corners of the criminal system. The prison authorities, aware that CECOT's reputation had reached a tipping point, began to implement drastic new measures. They introduced a more rigid hierarchy among inmates, pushing for stricter segregation. Gang members were isolated in even more secure facilities, and communication between prisoners was further restricted. The guards had become more militarized, often carrying rifles and wearing body armor, prepared for the worst. And yet, despite all these efforts, CECOT remained a ticking time bomb. But out on the streets, far from the prison's walls, the story was beginning to shift. The public's opinion on the government's approach was starting to fracture. Those who had once been vocal in their support of the president's hardline policies began questioning if the costs of victory were too high. The country's political landscape was changing, and public sentiment was beginning to lean toward a more reformist approach. The rebellion inside CECOT had done more than just shift power within the prison, it had challenged the very foundation of the government's authority. The violent backlash had ignited debates on human rights, criminal justice reform, and the effectiveness of an authoritarian approach to gang violence. People began to ask, is this the future of El Salvador? Was the cost of defeating gangs worth the human toll it was taking on the people inside the prisons and those who had lived their whole lives outside? For the prisoners still alive in CECOT, the question was simple, what comes next? Was the war truly over, or had the government simply started a new chapter of oppression? The breaking of the system. The days following the rebellion inside CECOT were fraught with tension. The battle for survival had now entered a new phase, a phase where survival wasn't just about living from day to day, but about facing the crushing weight of consequences, sacrifice, and the inevitable question of what came after the violence. As the government began its purge of the prison system, it became clear that CECOT was no longer just a prison. It had transformed into a symbol of El Salvador's war on gangs, a place where the rules of law and order had long been forgotten. Even the guards, who were once merely figures of authority, had become instruments of repression, caught up in a system of control and violence that they had little ability to escape. The military had fortified the prison, surrounding it with heavily armed units, barbed wire, and watchtowers. For the prisoners inside, the added fortifications only served to deepen the sense of entrapment. The walls, once just physical barriers, had become a reminder of their inability to escape the tyranny of the system that had placed them here. No one was free, not even the guards. The government's goal had been clear from the beginning, to break the gangs' power and reduce their control over the prison. But what they didn't fully understand was the unshakable influence the gangs had within the prison walls. For decades, they had ruled the prison system, creating a parallel world where the law of the land was defined by loyalty, power, and fear. No amount of military presence or increased surveillance would change that fact overnight. The gang network, resilience against authority. The MS 13 and 18th Street Gang, two of the most powerful criminal organizations in El Salvador, had long ago learned the art of survival in captivity. Even in the harshest conditions, they had found ways to bypass the authorities, smuggling in weapons, drugs, and cell phones that allowed them to continue operating within and outside the prison. The government had underestimated the gang's ability to adapt. They didn't just survive, they thrived, and in some ways, they had become stronger with every crackdown. At the heart of this complex prison ecosystem, gang leaders, who were often segregated in maximum security units, remained the puppeteers pulling the strings from behind bars. Even when placed in solitary confinement, they continued to coordinate attacks on rivals, plan smuggling routes, and issue orders through coded messages or underground networks. Their power extended far beyond their physical confinement, reaching into the streets, where their influence over the gang territories remained untouched. One of the most unsettling things about CECOT was the illusion of control. On the surface, it seemed like the government had established a firm grip on the prison. Military operations had intensified, and in many ways, the prison had been turned into a fortress. Yet, despite the overwhelming power of the state, the gang's resilience remained a dark reminder that no amount of force could easily dismantle what had been built over years of criminal enterprise. There were forces in CECOT that the government could not contain, no matter how many soldiers it sent. But while the gang leaders still had power, not every inmate was aligned with them. The general population, many of whom were not affiliated with gangs, found themselves caught in the crossfire of this deadly struggle. For some, the choice between gang loyalty and survival had already been made long ago. Others, however, had yet to choose a side, forced to navigate the violent landscape in search of safety. The struggles of the ordinary inmate. In CECOT, the conditions were nightmarish. Overcrowding, limited food, and the constant threat of violence had created a toxic environment where even the smallest infraction could result in a beating, or worse, death. For the non-gang affiliated inmates, the struggle was even more intense. They were often viewed as weak by the gang members, and in a place where strength was currency, weakness was something to be exploited. Those who resisted the pressure to join a gang often found themselves isolated, living in constant fear. Even basic necessities, such as food, water, and medical care, had to be bartered or stolen from others. The government's harsh tactics had created an atmosphere where prisoners were forced to choose between becoming part of the gang network and accepting their fate as victims of the system. Many of the prisoners who had once lived relatively peaceful lives in CECOT had now become part of the collateral damage in the war on gangs. The violence they had once feared was now a part of their daily existence. The government's actions, though aimed at eliminating the gang's hold on the prison, had failed to address the deeper issues that had led to the gang's rise in the first place: poverty, corruption, and the breakdown of social systems both inside and outside the prison. The growing resentment among the prisoners, those who felt abandoned by the state, was palpable. The harsh measures had pushed many to the brink. They began to ask questions: had the government's war on gangs improved their lives, or had it just created more victims? Had the crackdown on gang leaders truly dismantled the system, or had it simply shifted the balance of power in CECOT? In their quest for justice, the government had only compounded the sense of injustice inside the prison walls. The dark side of reform. The government's mission to reform CECOT, though driven by a desire to break the gang's control, had come with unexpected consequences. The militarization of the prison had created a climate of fear that permeated every corner of the facility. Not only were gang members subjected to the most intense isolation and punishment, but everyone inside CECOT, whether they were gang members, innocent bystanders, or political prisoners, had become part of the broader system of repression. As the government's efforts continued, it became clear that CECOT was not just a prison, it had become a symbol of the state's war on the people. And the violence was far from over. Despite their brutal tactics, the government's zero-tolerance policy had only escalated tensions. And while the military may have regained control over parts of the prison, the cycle of violence continued. For the prisoners who had been involved in the rebellion, there was no turning back. Even as they faced retribution, they knew that their actions had forced the government to confront a truth it had tried to ignore for years: the gangs were not the sole problem. The prison system, with its broken, oppressive framework, was a breeding ground for violence. If the government didn't address the root causes of this violence, the cycle would continue. As the dust settled inside CECOT, the question remained: had the rebellion truly changed anything? Would the government's heavy-handed approach continue to dominate, or had the inmates' struggle ignited a larger movement for reform that would someday reach the streets and shake the foundations of the prison system? Inside CECOT, the answer was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the battle was far from over. As dawn broke over CECOT, the prison was still in chaos. The rebellion had been fierce, and although the government forces had regained control over key areas, the spirit of resistance was far from broken. The prisoners, once overwhelmed by the power of the state, had found something more dangerous than weapons to fight with: hope. In a place where hope had long been eradicated, the recent uprising had rekindled the flames of defiance and unity among those who had nothing left to lose. The government, in its relentless pursuit of control, had made one crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated the resilience of the very people they sought to oppress. The prisoners, who had once lived in constant fear, had come to understand the most important lesson of all: they were stronger together. The war that began with an attempt to crush gang violence had spiraled into something much more complicated: a fight for justice, equality, and survival. Yet, despite the resistance, the government's tactics were not changing. Military forces continued to flood CECOT, securing one area after another. The retribution against gang members was swift, brutal, and widespread. Prisoners who had participated in the uprising were systematically pulled from their cells, shackled, and taken to punishment blocks, where the brutality of the military reached new heights. These inmates were subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment, forced into isolation with no access to basic necessities. The state strategy was clear: break them, strip them of any dignity they had left, and send a message to the rest of the population that defiance would not be tolerated. The military presence was constant, and the prison guards, now emboldened by their support, carried out the government's wishes with chilling efficiency. Those who had survived the battle in the prison, having once felt empowered by the resistance, now found themselves facing an even darker reality. The government had shown no mercy, and the punishment for rebellion was severe. But despite the fear, the survivors were far from defeated. Inside CECOT, life had always been a fight, but the war for freedom, identity, and self-worth had grown to something much bigger. For many prisoners, the rebellion had not just been about escaping the government's control, it had been about asserting their humanity. It had been about saying to the world that even in the most brutal system, the human spirit could not be crushed. The gang leaders, despite their physical confinement, were still orchestrating the resistance from their isolated cells. They had become symbols of the prisoners' defiance. They were no longer just criminals, they were martyrs for a cause that extended beyond gang power. They were figures who represented something greater. The fight against a system that cared more about power and control than about the lives it destroyed. In the weeks following the rebellion, the prison saw more violence, more bloodshed, and more retribution. But it also saw something else: hope was still alive. The underground network of resistance, made up of inmates, guards, and even some sympathetic outsiders, continued to grow stronger. Every prison riot, every fight, every act of defiance pushed the authorities closer to their breaking point. And while the state continued its attempts to quash the rebellion, the resistance was undeterred. One of the most chilling aspects of CECOT's internal war was the psychological toll it took on everyone involved. The guards who had once been trusted figures of authority were now caught in a moral conflict. Some had long abandoned their duty, realizing that the government was only using them as pawns in a war they couldn't win. Others, still loyal to the state, found themselves torn between following orders and recognizing the human cost of the government's policies. For the general population of inmates, the situation had become a waiting game. The daily violence was a constant reminder of what awaited those who refused to comply with the system. Yet, there was also a growing realization that the endgame was near. The government had shown its hand, and the prisoners knew they were not going to be easily broken. They had nothing left to lose, and the government's overreach had turned the prison system into a war zone. The lines had been drawn, and the prisoners had shown that, no matter what the state threw at them, they would never surrender their humanity. In the heart of CECOT, the gangs were solidifying their power, consolidating their influence over key areas of the prison. As the government's grip tightened, so did the gangs' control. For some, this meant more violence, more drugs, and more exploitation. But for others, it meant safety and protection in an environment where chaos reigned. The gangs had become more than just criminal enterprises, they were now a shadow government, offering stability where the state had failed. Yet the prisoners knew that, despite the power the gangs held, their rebellion was not over. The prison might have been on the verge of returning to normalcy, but the resistance was still alive. The government might have regained control of the prison, but they hadn't won the war. The prisoners were still fighting for their dignity, for their humanity, and for their future. And, deep inside CECOT's walls, there was a quiet, simmering belief that this war had only just begun. The rebellion had been crushed, but the message had been sent. It was a message that the government couldn't ignore, the prisoners would never submit. Their bodies might be confined behind bars, but their spirit, their fight for justice, was free. And that was something the government could never control. As CECOT returned to a semblance of order, the world outside continued to watch. The international community had seen the violence, the bloodshed, and the injustice. And while the government's grip on the prison was restored, the war for the soul of El Salvador had only just begun. As we close the story of CECOT, it's clear that what transpired within those walls was more than just a rebellion, more than just a fight between prisoners and the state. It was a battle for human dignity, a fight for survival in a place where humanity had been stripped away, leaving only the struggle for power, control, and identity. Inside CECOT, the lines between right and wrong blurred. The inmates, once viewed simply as criminals by the outside world, had become symbols of resistance, symbols of a broken system that had failed to protect its own people. The government, in its efforts to suppress gang influence, had inadvertently created a breeding ground for even more chaos, more violence, and more defiance. But through it all, one thing stood clear: the human spirit cannot be easily broken. The events in CECOT were not isolated. They are part of a much larger story that spans across El Salvador and beyond. The gangs, while brutal and unforgiving, are a product of a system that has failed its people, a system that has allowed corruption, violence, and poverty to take root. CECOT became the microcosm of that failure. The government's response, while harsh and unforgiving, was an attempt to restore order, but in doing so, it ignored the very core of the problem, a society broken at its foundations. The prison was merely the manifestation of the country's deeper social issues, and until those issues are addressed, CECOT will remain a symbol of a cycle of violence that has no clear end in sight. For the prisoners, the rebellion was not just about resisting government control, it was about reclaiming their humanity. Every prisoner who participated, whether out of fear or defiance, sought to prove that they were more than just numbers, more than just criminals in the eyes of the law. They were people, with voices, with histories, with dreams of freedom. And though the rebellion may have been crushed, their message echoed far beyond the prison walls: they would never be silenced, not as long as they could continue to fight for their dignity. The outside world, too, took notice. The international community couldn't ignore the stark images of violence, the cries for justice, and the stories of abuse and human rights violations coming out of CECOT. What happened within those walls was a warning, that no amount of military power, no amount of force, could silence the voices of the oppressed forever. The world now knows that El Salvador's prison system is a powder keg waiting to explode, and the government will have to reckon with the fact that the fight for justice is not a battle that can be won with force alone. CECOT, like many prisons around the world, remains a symbol of power and control, but it is also a symbol of resilience. While the rebellion may have been suppressed, it has sparked something much greater, a conversation about prison reform, human rights, and the cycle of violence that perpetuates itself within the prison system. It has raised questions about what it means to be human, what it means to survive, and what it means to stand up for what is right. The prisoners, though defeated, have shown the world that they are more than just their crimes. They are people, caught in a system that seeks to erase them. And in this struggle, they have not only fought for themselves, but for those who have no voice, for those who are forgotten, and for those who continue to suffer in the shadows of a broken system. As we conclude this story, remember that CECOT is not just a prison, it is a reflection of the challenges and struggles that exist far beyond its walls. It is a reminder that the fight for justice and dignity is not over, and that the battle will continue as long as systems of power continue to oppress, silence, and destroy the lives of those who have been cast aside by society. The story of CECOT may have ended, but its legacy will live on in the hearts of those who continue to fight for justice, for freedom, and for a world where no one is forgotten. And though the prison may have been rebuilt, the spirit of resistance will never fade. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy and clarity. While the events and themes discussed are based on factual information, the portrayal of certain events may be fictionalized or speculative. The accuracy of some accounts is based on publicly verified reports, court filings, and news investigations. This story aims to provide insight into the conditions and struggles within one of the most dangerous prisons in El Salvador and does not promote or glorify violence or crime in any form.